All right, everybody, I think we're going to get started with our next speaker. Thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. David Weintraub. So thank you so much for being here with us. David is actually Billy Teets' PhD advisor, as I understand. So we have both here tonight. So David Weintraub is an expert in star and planet formation and also science communication. So this will be an awesome talk. His favorite drink is Mountain Dew. And a fun fact is that his Eddington bicycle number is 66. And this is very impressive if you know what the Eddington bicycle number is. And that's as many rides as you've taken up to the number of miles that you've ridden. So that's 66 rides with 66 miles, right? That's really impressive. So, yeah, give it a round of applause for that. And tonight, David will be telling us about the Star of Bethlehem. So, take it away.
All right, thank you. This is a fun night to talk about the Star of Bethlehem because it's the first night of Hanukkah.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so here we go. Gotta learn from doing. There we go. All right. Don't want to be on that one. All right. So the question for you is this: when was Jesus born? What's the answer to that? The summer, I heard. No takers here in this show. December 25th. Yeah, that's what you're supposed to say. Of course, that's wrong. There are two parts to the answer to this question. The first is that December 25th is the wrong answer. Almost certainly Jesus was born in the spring, but we don't know for sure. The first indication that December 25th was celebrated was from a calendar from the year 384. So prior to that, the Roman Catholic Church, the early Christian church, did not celebrate the birth of Jesus. The Epiphany was celebrated, the resurrection was celebrated, but the birth wasn't. But by the 4th century, the birth was celebrated. Why December 25th? Probably because in the late 3rd century, the Roman emperor decided that December 25th would be celebrated as a holiday to celebrate and honor the the Persian sun god Mithras. So December 25th became a great holiday throughout the Roman Empire, and the early Christians who were persecuted probably co-opted December 25th in order to hide their celebration. But we don't know. About the year, what year was Jesus born? 0. That's wrong too, of course. Our entire calendar was not created until the 6th century. This guy, Dionysius Exiguus, Dennis the Little or Dennis the Humble, in 523 decided to invent a new calendar. What he did was he added up the lengths of years that all the Roman emperors had reigned, all the way back to the year when King Herod, who was not a Roman emperor, but when King Herod died, and he said Jesus was born on December 25th of the year -1. And the Christian era began exactly 1 week later on January 1st of the year 1. So there was no year 0. He also miscalculated the lengths of those reigns. And as best as we can tell, King Herod died in the year 4 BCE. King Herod reigned as king from 37 to 4 BCE, so that brackets the span of years when Jesus could have been born. But almost certainly it was in the last few years of King Herod's reign. All right, the obvious questions. The Star of Bethlehem, a bright object in the sky. Was it a comet? No. Comets in ancient times were harbingers of doom and gloom. They foretold the destruction of empires, the deaths of kings, the appearance of plague. You did not want to be associated with a comet. The ancients also observed comets. They knew when comets were there. We have no historical records of any bright, naked-eye comets in the sky during the period of time, the years that we're interested. Come on. Was the Star of Bethlehem a supernova, another bright object in the sky? No. At the time Jesus was born, Aristotle was the person who decided how the heavens work. Now, he'd been dead for 400 years. But everybody believed that Aristotle was right. Everybody. And Aristotle said that changes cannot happen in the heavens. Stars don't get brighter. Stars don't get dimmer. Stars don't change color. New stars don't appear. Stars don't disappear. So nobody would have been looking for a bright new star, and no one would have believed that a bright new star could even exist. And if such a thing had happened, it would have been recorded, because lots of people were looking, and certainly would have been recorded in India or China or somewhere else. No such thing occurred. Oh. There we go. Too far. Back one. Okay. Was the Star of Bethlehem a planetary conjunction when the moon and one or two planets came close together in the sky, producing a bright blob in the sky? No. Such a thing happens regularly, but they're not bright objects, and they make no sense with what we'll see we know about the supposed Star of Bethlehem. All right, that one. Back one. There we go. All right, what do we know about the Star of Bethlehem? Almost nothing. The only historical record, the only mention of this thing called the Star of Bethlehem is in the Gospel of Matthew. The first line of the Gospel of Matthew reads as is seen here. At the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews?" Now, I should note there's no underlining in the original Gospel of Matthew. So I have put that there to draw your attention to certain parts of the story. The first thing that's underlined is that in the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born. These wise men didn't show up, according to this story, when Jesus was a baby in the manger. They showed up after he was born. Almost certainly, as we'll see, several years after he was born. What about the wise men who came from the east? Let's go to there. Got it. Okay. The wise men were the Magi. This is the Greek word used by Matthew. The wise men, the Magi, were originally Zoroastrian priests in Babylon. They predicted the future. They read omens. They interpreted dreams. All over Babylon, there were people stationed in towers called ziggurats, in which they watched the sky. They recorded bright flashes, lightning, comets, storms. All this was reported back to the Magi, and they explained what it meant. They were watching the sky. The Magi became known for their astrological practices because they were interpreting the sky as omens. Tertullian, in the 2nd century of the modern era, said the East considers the Magi to be kings. This is where the 3 kings thing came from. Magi does not mean kings, but that's where the misinterpretation came from. As far as where the Magi came from, in this map of the Near East, we've got Babylon here. We've got Jerusalem over here. If you were wise men in Babylon, if you were the Magi, and you wanted to head to Jerusalem, you did not walk from east to west across the Arabian Desert. Nobody did that. You died. The way you get there is you go up the Tigris-Euphrates Valley up toward Anatolia, through Syria, down through Lebanon, down to Jerusalem. You go northwest, and then you go south. You don't go from east to west. But those are our Magi. There we go. All right, continuing with Matthew. For we observed his star at its rising, and have come to pay him homage. When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. There's a prophecy. Bethlehem? Okay. The so-called prophecy of Balaam is in the book of Numbers. The prophecy of Balaam says, there shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab and destroy all the children of Sheth. This prophecy was taken by the Jewish people in Judea 2,000 years ago to mean a Messiah was coming, a Savior was coming, a king was coming, someone was going to come take care of them, because it really sucked to be Jewish back then. And King Herod made it even worse. So beginning in 37 BCE, the Jewish community was looking for a Savior. They were watching for signs of a Savior. This is what Matthew was referring to in the prophecy. I give up. All right. Continuing with Matthew. Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, not the baby, the child. And when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage. When they had heard from the king, they set out, and there, ahead of them, went the star that they had seen at its rising. There it is again, at its rising. Until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. Everything that is underlined in that bit of text comes from ancient astrology, not from ancient astronomy. Those are all English interpretations of technical terms used by ancient astrologers. So let's go down the rabbit hole. Traditional Babylonian astronomy began long before 700 BCE. In traditional Babylonian astronomy, they interpreted whatever happened in the heavens in terms of what that might mean for the city-state, for the empire, for the king, for the rulers. It was about the welfare of the state and the welfare of the rulers. It had nothing to do with us little people. But beginning in about 7 BCE, Babylonian astronomy became what we would call birth date astronomy, horoscopes, in which you could take the positions of the sun and the moon and the planets on the day you were born and use that to interpret what your future or what your health might be. The Babylonian astronomers in this time period established the constellations of the zodiac. They observed celestial phenomenon very carefully. They mapped out the moving positions of the planets. And in 410 BCE, we have evidence of the first known horoscope, the first natal astrological chart. In the 4th century BCE, the Babylonian astronomers were surpassed by the Greek astronomers. Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great had taken his armies, he conquered Persia, all this knowledge came back to Greece, and the Greek astronomers, who also had a lot of strong mathematical chops, decided to apply this to the motions of the stars. Now, I'm going to set this in motion for you, or you will, and you can watch the planets move. The stars are known as fixed stars. The planets move through the stars. They're known as wandering stars. And if you watch some of them, here's the sun. The sun is going to catch up and pass Jupiter and Saturn. And here goes Mercury, and watch what Mercury does. It stops. It turns around. It goes backwards, and it'll stop again, and then turn around and goes forwards again. That's known as a retrograde loop. Mercury is not going backwards. It's not stopping. This has to do with the relative motions of two objects orbiting the sun at different speeds. But this is what they observed. And the Greek astronomers figured out how to calculate the positions and predict the future positions of these objects. By about 100 BCE, the greatest of the ancient Greek astronomers, Hipparchus, had come up with models for predicting the motion of the sun and the moon, from which he could predict eclipses to within a few minutes. And you could still use his models and his calculations today for the sun and the moon. Hipparchus couldn't figure this out for the planets. He was close, but not close enough. The planetary motions were finally calculated by Ptolemy about 200 years later, but at this time, at the time of Jesus' birth, astronomers could calculate the position of the sun and the moon very accurately. The planets reasonably accurate. Next slide, yes. There we go. All right. So by about the last century BCE, astronomers and astrologers didn't actually look at the sky very much. They simply calculated what was going on. That was good enough because they could predict the future. They could predict where these different objects were going to be. There we go. So let's do some astrology. Let's learn some astrology. But I'm not going to cast a horse. First thing to note is who would have paid attention to an astrological prediction? Within the Roman Empire, the answer is almost everybody. The only exception, the only community that would have ignored astrology was the Jewish community. Because the Jews had come up with this idea that there was one God. And the sun was not a god, the moon was not a god, Jupiter was not a god. The gods were not in the sky. The gods in the sky that didn't exist could not control your life. So the Jewish community despised the whole idea of astrology. But everybody else was pretty big on astrology. All right, back one. All right, so what about Matthew? Matthew wrote his gospel in the years of about 70 to 90 of the Common Era. He lived in Antioch. He was a Jewish Christian. He was writing for an audience that he hoped would believe in this idea of Jesus. And his audience believed in astrology. He put two and two together. So let's come back to the next slide. Next slide. There we go. Back one. All right, so back to the first line of Matthew here, or thereabouts. For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage. At its rising has often been poorly interpreted as in the east. In the east, yeah, sort of, but it's wrong. Matthew was actually using this phrase, ente Anatoli, in Greek. Ente Anatoli means at the rising. It is a technical term in ancient astrology. The translation in the east sort of works, but it's wrong because where do stars rise and set? They rise in the east, they set in the west. So a star is rising in the east, but that's not actually what this term means. A star at its rising in astrology refers to what's called a heliacal rising. Next slide. Maybe that's not the next slide. Is that the next slide? Okay. A heliacal rising, we'll see, I've got a picture in a moment. A heliacal rising occurs when a planet is reborn after being hidden in the glare of the sun. So if you think about that movie we saw a moment ago, the planets are racing across the sky and they catch up with the sun. And when they're in the glare of the sun, you can't see them. And according to ancient astrological understanding, when a planet was in the glare of the sun, its powers were destroyed. The planet had no powers whatsoever. But when the planet finally passes by the sun and escapes the glare of the sun, it's reborn and its powers are strongest. And when it's reborn, it will rise just before the sun. And that first day, when the planet appears in the morning sky, after having disappeared in front or behind the sun, that is the heliacal rising. That is when the planet is at its most powerful. That's what the words ente atoli mean. They mean at its rising, which will happen in the east, but that's not what it's about. All right. If you're, back one. There we go. If you're trying to cast a horoscope in this ancient tradition, there are a number of things you need to worry about. Most importantly, you need to worry about where the planets are. The planets are more powerful if they're in the right location, if they're in the right constellation, if they're in the right part of the right constellation. Their powers, their influence would change depending on where they were. The planets have influence even if they're below the horizon, even if they're up in the daytime when you can't see them. It doesn't matter whether you can see them. It just matters where they are. If they're on the eastern horizon rising, that's where they're most powerful. Next one. This works much better to just have you do that. What are called exaltations? A planet is exalted if it's, again, in the right place. What's important, these coins show the ram, Aries, on ancient Judean coins. Aries was the constellation associated with Judea. A planet is exalted if it's in its sign. The sun is exalted in Judea. The sun is the most important of the wandering stars. So if you want a royal horoscope, the sun had better be in Aries. So an ancient astrologer looking for a regal horoscope, one that predicted the birth of a king, would have looked for a horoscope that included the sun in Judea. That happens every 12 months, every spring. Next slide. What are known as astrological trines are constellations that are separated by 120 degrees. The constellations associated with Aries are Sagittarius and Leo. The other planets associated with Aries, in addition to the sun, would be Jupiter and Saturn, the biggest, most important planets. If the sun is most powerful when it's in Aries, that's what you want for a royal horoscope. Jupiter is most powerful if it rises before the sun. So Jupiter also will be in Aries. Even better, you want your planet Jupiter to be in conjunction with the moon. So you want the moon to be in Aries. And even better, you want the moon to eclipse Jupiter. That's a lot to ask. So that becomes a rare horoscope. Next. Here we have the constellation Aries. We have the sun in Aries, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, the moon. So this type of configuration is what you'd be looking for if you wanted a royal horoscope. If you were looking for something like this, all the planets are where the sun are. You can't see them. They're up in the daytime. There's no bright object in the sky to look at. But there might be astrological configuration of importance. What are known as attendant planets are positions of planets which protect the sun and the moon. So the moon is protected, here's the moon. The moon is protected when Venus and Mars rise after the moon. They're then protecting the moon. The sun is protected if Saturn and Jupiter rise before the sun, which is here below the horizon. So this configuration would have the planets protecting the sun and the moon. Next slide. There is one heliacal rising of Jupiter that occurs in the time window of interest to us. April 17th, 6 BCE. It's the only one. So if you want a horoscope in which Jupiter rises before the sun and experiences a heliacal rising as mentioned in Matthew, this is the only game in town. So Matthew would seem to be referring to April 17th of 6 BCE. And the Magi wouldn't have been out there looking for this. They would have calculated. They would have predicted it. Now, since they couldn't predict the positions of the planets perfectly accurately, they would have predicted this, and then they would have gone out to look for it to confirm the prediction. Next slide. So on April 17th, Jupiter would have emerged and risen just before the sun. It would have experienced a heliacal rising. Jupiter was then occulted by the moon 3 hours later at noon that day. The sun and Jupiter and the moon and Saturn are all in Aries. Venus is in Pisces, Mercury in Taurus. Mars and Mercury rise after the sun, after the moon. So the moon has attendant planets. It's protected. Its strength and powers are protected. Jupiter and Saturn rise before the sun, so its powers are protected. This is a big deal horoscope if you want a horoscope. Next slide. Matthew writes, when they had heard the king, they departed. And lo, the star which they saw in the east, at its rising, went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. How does a star go before them? And how does the star stand over the child? In the mythology of the Christmas star, the wise men followed the star to the east. And that doesn't work because they had to go northwest and then they had to go south. So that just doesn't work at all. But in addition, how are you going to get this star to just hang over the manger? And why that manger and not that manger? This doesn't mean any of that stuff. These are astrological terms. The word proagen is the Greek word which comes from proagesius, okay, which means to go before. Very precisely, it means to go in the same direction as the sky. For astronomy, a planet can have prograde motion or retrograde motion. It normally is moving prograde. The stars are going the other way. It's moving against the motion of the stars. But when it enters one of these retrograde loops, as we saw for Mercury, it's going backwards, which is actually going in the direction the stars are going. So the term proagen means the planet is going in the same direction as the stars. So that's what is mentioned in Matthew. Next slide. Epano is another technical astrological term. It means the planet is in this retrograde loop, but it stops moving. It stands over. What does that mean? In this retrograde loop, it's going this way, it stops right here. It spends about a week right here barely moving. To the naked eye, not moving. Then it goes retrograde, it goes before, and then it stops again, and then it goes the other direction. These are the astrological events that Matthew's referring to. Next slide. So on April 17th, the sun moves east into Taurus. We're over here at number 1. Jupiter becomes visible in the morning sky and then gets blared out by the bright sun. Jupiter then continues to drift in this direction. On the 23rd of August, Jupiter stops right here. It stands over, and then it goes backwards, and then it stops here, and then it moves forward again. By August 30th, Jupiter is going before. It's going retrograde. On October 27th, Jupiter re-enters Aries. That's good. Okay? From November 18th to December 19th, the sun is in Sagittarius. That's part of the trine for Aries. Jupiter and Saturn are in Aries. And on December 19th, Jupiter stops again. It's at its second station, its second stopping point in Aries. The Magi, who would have predicted this horoscope from April 17th, were apparently tracking the motion of the objects in the heavens for another 8 months because they would have predicted this event. They wanted to see if it was really true that all these astrological events could occur. And they watched, and on December 19th they said, yeah, this is a good horoscope. At that point, they would have gone looking for the baby king. And they would have wandered up the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and down toward Jerusalem, and it would have taken them 6 or 9 or 12 or 15 months to get there. So they didn't arrive when Jesus was a baby in the manger. If any of this were true at all, they arrived 2 years later. Next slide. So, the horoscope of April 17th, 6 BCE, really seems to be an unambiguous horoscope. All right? The heliacal rising of Jupiter combined with the lunar occultation could have been this Star of Bethlehem, but there was no bright star in the sky. This is just a bunch of predictions for what would be occurring out there. This event was almost certainly not calculated by the Magi in 4 BC or 6 BC. This is something that people almost certainly came up with after the fact. 100 years later, at the time of Matthew, he was living 50 years after the lifetime of Jesus. But astrologers could easily go backwards and say, we have this idea that we have a Messiah. Let's prove it to our audience. Let's come up with an astrological prediction. Let's go back and find an astrological birth date that is powerful, that would predict the birth of a king. And they found it. And then Matthew wrote about it. Best as we can tell, that would be the evidence for the Star of Bethlehem. That it was a post facto proof found later on by astrologers that either Matthew was associated with, or maybe Matthew was one himself, who was able to predict 100 years in the past that this event had occurred. That would be the Star of Bethlehem. And I will stop there. I certainly hope I didn't ruin this. Questions? Yes.
I have a question followed by a comment. So the question is about how you would think about in terms of science communication, astrology and astronomy. So would you take the point of view that you separate these, you divorce these from each other when taking a course perhaps in one area? Or do you kind of blend them together and sort of like a gateway is astrology, get interest, and then talk about astronomy after that?
Okay. To paraphrase that, how, as a professional astronomer, do I deal with astrology and astronomy? Do you study them both? How do you put the two together? Astrology is not astronomy, so I would never teach astrology in a class. But something that's fascinated me throughout my career are places where astronomy and religion bump into each other. The Star of Bethlehem is a great example of that. The birth of the universe, Big Bang cosmology, is another one. How did the whole universe come into being? When you take a close look at this idea for the Star of Bethlehem, it starts out as an astronomy question. Was there a comet? Was there a supernova? But it leads very directly into the story of Matthew, the only place where we have any information about the Star of Bethlehem, which turns out to be an astrology story. So I wouldn't teach anyone about astrology if they were astronomy students. I think that would be a mistake. I think they need to be separated. But astrology is an important part of the history of astronomy. Most famous astronomers that from before the current century or the last century, if you were to name an astronomer, they probably made their living as an astronomer. Tycho Brahe, Copernicus. Okay. They were astrologers. That's where the money was. Kepler was an astrologer who also did astronomy. It's only in modern times that we've really split the two. And you had a comment also?
I had a comment because I was just wondering, have you ever read the classic sci-fi tale Hyperion by Dan Simmons?
I don't think so.
So there's one of the main characters has the same name as you, and also discusses similar topics as you have.
So the character's name's David Weintraub?
Not David, but Weintraub. I highly recommend it.
There you go. All right. You'll have to find out. Other questions? All right. Back to you, Kevin.